This is the PR Podcast, a show about how public relations helps you tell your story to the world. We talk with great PR practitioners who have the skills, creativity, and just plain savvy to get their clients noticed. Now here's your host, Jody Fisher.
Hey, everyone, and welcome to the PR Podcast. I'm Jody Fisher. Thanks for joining us. Well, have you got yourself that PR Podcast plug yet? You know, this is the section of our show where we like to plug our friends. And anybody who knows me knows that I love to love on my friends, to let people know what cool things my friends are doing. And so if you're listening to this, you are my friend. And I want you to send us the cool stuff that you're doing. It's outside your 9 to 5. It's your website, it's your blog, it's your TikTok. Maybe you play the guitar, maybe you do something else that's cool. Let us know about it, right? Let us know what stokes your creativity. Let us know what gets your juices flowing, and inspire some other listeners. So send us a note on Twitter at the PR Podcast and send us your PR Podcast plug. We will mention you at the top of an upcoming show. Now let's get on to our very special guest today. We're getting into it. Erik Jacobsen is founder and CEO of both Lemonpie and Hatch, which helps clients use podcasting to grow their business. Erik got his start with Tim Ferriss, podcaster extraordinaire, and soon after he launched his own companies, where he's helped over 200 brands use podcast strategies to drive millions of downloads and millions of dollars worth of value. He has worked with A-list brands like HubSpot, FreshBooks, and Four Sigmatic. Erik, welcome to the PR Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. Looking forward to chatting today.
I feel like you are going to teach me a whole bunch of stuff here. So let's just start at the start, right? When did you first hear about podcasting? What got you into it?
Yeah, so after I graduated from college, this was about 12 years ago or so. I was working a job that I was pretty miserable in, and I was traveling a lot, and I was driving, 10, 15, 20 hours a week, basically, for the job. After a few months of doing that and just listening to music, I realized I need something else, like some other content. But this was really, really early. Like there was nobody talking about podcasting back then. This is like 2011, 2012. But I remembered one of my professors from college, she had a mic around her neck one day when she was giving her lesson. And she said, "Hey, I'm going to put this up on Blackboard as a podcast so you can access the audio later." And I remembered that for whatever reason. And then I remember seeing something about Apple Podcasts. So I went into Apple, I found their podcast button, and I just typed in the word startups just to see what would come up. And what came up at that time was still shows that are running to this day. Andrew Warner's Mixergy podcast, which is one of the longest running entrepreneurship podcasts in the world. And then Jason Calacanis's This Week in Startups. And so I just clicked it. I just downloaded it and I queued it up on my drive. And it blew my mind what I was able to learn from these entrepreneurs talking about building their business. And it was an eye-opening experience to me on what is possible in life and business. And I just became obsessed with listening to podcasts while I was trying to plan what I was going to do with my life, honestly, and with my career. And those podcasts really inspired me, motivated me, educated me. And not only did I learn how to think about starting and running a business, but I decided because of the impact podcasting had on me, I wanted it to be in podcasting. And so that's really what set me off on the journey was just not enjoying where I was at and finding podcasts, and they helped show me the light.
Isn't that always the way that what is it? They say that what's the mother of inspiration? There's a phrase there, but it sounds like your dissatisfaction was the mother of your inspiration there, right? And that's kind of where we all end up at one point some point in our careers. Like, I don't like this thing. I'm going to go do something else.
Yes,
that's really interesting. Now, was there radio in your background at all?
No, none, literally none. I didn't know anything about how to create a podcast. I didn't know anybody who had a podcast. I just was obsessed with the medium itself.
Okay.
And I knew I wanted to create a business inside of podcasting as a result. And I got lucky because I stayed at that job for about 3 or 4 years. And when I quit and I started down the path of trying to figure out something to do inside of podcasting. It was end of 2014, 2015. So it wasn't too early to where me doing something in the medium was not possible. And I was just way too early to where there would be no adoption, but it was earlier than most, such that like it was sort of the perfect time where I got in earlier than most people. So there was opportunity for me, but it wasn't so early that like it made no business sense to be in that industry. And so yeah, spent a couple years just sort of pitching my way into big, the biggest podcasters in the world, doing some freelance work for them and stuff like that. And then I ended up launching Lemonpie and Hatch, once I figured out the business model that would work.
And anyone who has ever clicked on podcasts knows the name Tim Ferriss, right? You worked with Tim for a while.
Exactly.
What did that experience teach you, and how did that get your legs under you?
That taught me that I was on the right path. And it taught me that my intuition and my gut feel for the direction and the execution that I was doing was correct. It took a long time, and there were lots of moments of doubt, to be honest. It's not a quick and straightforward path to try to go from, a corporate job to creating your own income in an industry that most people still have never heard of. Like when I talk to my family members, they're like, what are you doing? You quit a great job to do podcasts? What is that radio? Like, what is that? I've never heard of it. And so being able to prove value to someone like Tim and something that I could offer, and then being able to sort of quote unquote close that deal and actually like get an engagement with him, it showed me that there was value and importance to the ideas that I had in podcasting. It ultimately didn't create the ultimate business model, but what it did do was show me I was on the right path.
And what were some of your original content ideas when you were doing those early podcasts? What did you focus on?
Yeah. So the first real 18 months of me starting on my own journey with this was pitching these very, very large and influential podcasters like Tim an idea. And the idea was the value of their content was all locked up in audio. And while I was driving, Tim's episodes were 2 or 3 hours long, and they were just so valuable to me, and so much I was able to learn through them. But I wasn't able to take notes really while I was doing them. You go to the show notes page and it's just a bunch of links, but there really wasn't much context for the lessons that were taught in the episode. So, and yeah, you could do a transcript, but who wants to read a 40-page, terribly written, really hard to read transcript? So what I pitched them was essentially curated blog posts. So I would take their episodes and I would write very custom curated blog posts of the lessons that were learned through them that they could put into ebooks or, actually articles on their site and things like that. And so that's what I ended up doing for Tim. What he ended up deciding to do was to parlay that concept into an actual physical book. So originally it was going to be ebooks. He ended up creating Tools of Titans. I don't know if you recall that book or not, but that book was an aggregation of lessons from his podcast. It ended up becoming a New York Times bestseller. And I do not want to take credit for that idea. I'm sure he had been thinking about that, but I played a small part in creating some of the content that he was able to use for that book, and maybe, inspiring to move that up the queue in a project that he would work on. So that's ultimately what I was working on, was helping him, on the back end with that sort of content.
See, but that sounds super familiar to me in what we do in PR when we talk about getting clients hits, in traditional media, whether it's that TV hit or that newspaper article, whatever. It doesn't stop with the one thing, that one finished product. You then turn that around and merchandise it and turn it into other pieces of content. And that may seem very natural now, or it may seem natural to us, but it's not that obvious to everybody. And I'm continually surprised when I make that suggestion to people. Oh, you did that thing. Now turn it into this thing and turn it into that thing and take that and spread it around. You don't have to reinvent the wheel every time, because you want people to hear that thing and what you did. And maybe they're just not looking at where you did it the first time because they're looking over there and they expect to find it over there. So put it over there too. You kind of did that original.
Yes. And that was going from podcast or audio content to book. The reverse is also true as well. And this is where the inspiration came for actually creating Lemonpie. The inspiration came from Lemonpie was from the reverse. So I was paying attention to hundreds of podcasts at that point. And what I noticed was back then, 2015, usually this strategy was being executed by authors. So they would write a book. Oftentimes, business nonfiction authors would write a business related book. And all of a sudden I would see them appear on 50 to 100 podcasts that I was paying attention to over a short period of time as a guest. And so that was the light bulb moment for me, which was this was a new modern form of PR and one that was actually getting more awareness for the book across, and using the book as an entry point to get onto those shows as well. But nobody was really, I didn't see anybody helping brands create that sort of execution back then. And so that's actually literally why I created Lemonpie, was to help companies do that very thing. And still to this day, that strategy is just like growing and growing and growing in terms of like really being a core piece of, marketing and PR for a lot of companies now.
So you opened the door there. Let's talk about those two companies and what they do.
So Lemonpie is our podcast PR agency. So this is where we help CEOs and executives get interviewed, the long form 30 to 60 minute, typically in length interviews on their customers' favorite podcasts. And then what we realized after a while of doing that is the marketing teams at those companies would ask us like, hey, should we have our own podcast as a company? And I believed in the medium. And so the answer was always yes. But we were sort of recommending they just go over to, get help with that from other vendors and things like that. And we just decided, hey, let's create our own company to help brands do that. And that's what Hatch is. So Hatch is our company that helps brands create their own podcasts, and all for one flat, low monthly rate. And we provide the editing and the strategy for them to succeed with that.
Now, what is because I've had lots of clients ask me about starting their own podcast. I got into this PR podcast, as a hobby a couple of years ago, just because I'm an old radio guy. I like interviewing people and talking with my friends. And so it's natural for me, but it's not natural for everybody, right? What do people need to consider before they start a podcast? And I'm talking about like a client, like a brand, whether it's a nonprofit or a company or whoever. What do you walk them through in starting their own podcast?
Totally. Yeah. And there's a lot that can go into this. First and foremost, what I would say is to not feel like you have to be a professional host or an experienced storyteller or journalist or radio person in order to have a successful podcast. The thing that is the most important is that you have expertise in the topic that you are creating a show around. That is it. As long as you have that, you can get better and get a feel for how you want to talk about things and develop your own voice and things like that. A lot of people do not like the sound of their own voice at first. And so that can be a little bit of a barrier. But the good news is that people want to tune into people that they can learn things from. That is especially in business related content. That is it. And so if you have something to teach, and presumably you do, if you're working at a company or have your own company, that is the bar for success. Now, the question of what type of podcast, what's the angle of it, what's the format of it, all of those things are important. And, we can go into that. But first, I would say, as long as you've got expertise that you can share, and my threshold for expertise is essentially, if you can talk about something for 60 minutes with zero preparation, you have expertise in that. That's like one measure of, do you have expertise in that topic? The other thing I would say is, before starting a podcast, I would recommend being in a place where you feel comfortable and good about the positioning of your company. So you know who are your best customers and why you are the best solution for them. And you are signing them up in terms of a conversion rate at the rate that you find acceptable. And the reason for that is I think it is always smart to start creating content in any form, to be honest, to get awareness for your company. But I think the most important thing to do is have the foundation of knowing what audience you want to speak to with that content. And so knowing your positioning will help you do that. And so otherwise you could go down 6 to 12 months of creating a podcast that's for the wrong people or with the wrong message to the right people. And so having the correct strategy is the most important thing. The execution, how to get it on Apple, how to get it on Spotify, how many episodes per week, all those things are sort of like the 20%. The 80% is who are you talking to and what is the differentiation of your content that will make them want to listen to every single episode and never miss a single episode. And then it's to the right people. So those are just a few things there.
Yeah, that's some terrific advice. I fully agree. I was also hearing you start to approach the word that I was thinking of in my head, which is consistency, right?
Yeah.
Whether it doesn't have to be once a day or once a week or once a whatever, but it's got to be regular. You can't post a podcast and then wait 3 months and then do another one. And then, I got 2, so I'll do 2 now. And it's inconsistent and sort of people don't know when to expect it.
Yes.
Is there an ideal formula for consistency? I mean,
so the way you can win with podcasts is a combination of quantity and quality. So if, let's say you have, in an objective sense, like if you ask 10 people who are listening to 5 different podcasts, which one is the best? And they all would say that would mean you would have the highest quality show. If that were to be true, then you could get away with producing less frequent episodes. But that's difficult to do. It's difficult to be the absolute best podcast in a category, but let's just say, for sake of argument, you are. So you could, in that case, presumably still win, even if you produce less episodes than your competitors. But without that, then you do want more frequent episodes. The standard cadence is like 1 episode per week. But let's say you've got a competing show that is, let's just say, for argument's sake, just as good as yours. If you're producing a weekly show and they're producing a weekly show, there's really not much that's giving you the edge and why someone would become more of a fan of your show and have more of a habit. So if you could produce twice a week and they're producing once a week, you're actually going to beat them because you're going to be in front of the listener, in front of the audience that you want to get in front of more. You're going to have more at-bats, more episodes, more hooks, more angles, more repetition, more habit. So the best combination is having the best quality in terms of, and that's subjective. It's for the best, it's for the audience. And you really, really focused on creating content that is unmissable. People want to listen to every episode. They make it to the end of every episode. They don't want to miss one, but also doing it at a more frequent rate than anybody else. And so I wouldn't recommend starting there. Starting with biweekly or weekly is perfectly fine, with the goal of, trying to get up to as frequent as possible, honestly. And you can mix up formats. Like it doesn't always have to be, 60-minute episodes 3 times a week. It could be, once a week, 60-minute episode. Another episode that same week could be a 7-minute solo, just stream of consciousness, sort of raw episode. And another one could be, you putting in your podcast feed an interview you did on someone else's show. So it doesn't mean you have to actually create 3 times as much content. Maybe you only have to create 5% more content, but you actually get 3 episodes out of it in the same week.
That's interesting to hear you say that you can mix it up like that, and it sounds attractive. But speaking of which, is there an ideal length for a podcast? I mean, I've heard people all over the map, and Tim's shows, like you said, used to run hours. I mean, there are other people, like you listen to a guy like Kevin Smith. He can go for 2 hours on a
Yes.
Star Wars movie, which I will listen to, but you know what I mean?
Yes,
Is
exactly.
there an
And
ideal length for a podcast?
yeah, so there's not a formula for it because there are in every direction you would look at for these sorts of things, you will find success. So you will find success in shows that every episode is less than 10 minutes. You will find successful case studies. You will also find successful case studies in shows that every episode is more than 2 hours. So the question is, people will listen to long form content. Their attention span is not short, but their consideration span is. So you have to get them hooked quickly, and the content has to be good to keep them going. But once they're in, they're going to be in. And then the only other thing I would mention for this is, if you go longer than 30 or 45 minutes in your episodes, it does not mean that it won't be successful. It just means that it has to be good enough for the listener to want to have stopped what they did in the 30-minute block of time that they had, and then come back to it and hit play again, rather than selecting a different episode. So because typically people are listening not in 2-hour straight increments on long form content, because people are listening to these while they're driving or running an errand or doing the dishes. And so what has been studied is that people are listening for about 30, 45 minutes in one sitting. And so the question is it compelling enough that they come back after they get back in their car from the grocery store and want to hit play again, or they select another episode? So that's kind of how to think about it. And again, it's a bar for quality is the real main thing.
And so it also sounds like sort of a meeting the expectation of the audience too. I mean, producing quality, but then meeting them where they expect to find you in terms of your appeal, right?
Yeah.
And I gotta listen to the rest of that story. I gotta hear the rest of what he was saying, that kind of thing.
Yes. You don't want content that is can be commoditized. So, if you're listening to someone who has been a guest on hundreds of podcasts, and it's one of your favorite people to listen to, maybe you will be compelled to want to listen to an extremely long episode with that person on it, if it's clear that the host is asking questions that this person has not really ever been asked before. So if you are sort of asking someone who very clearly has been on lots of different podcasts before, household name, what have you, but you're sort of asking the very obvious questions, you're going to get a lot of drop off. The retention is not going to be strong in that, because that interview has been done before. You want to try to create a one-on-one in your podcast episode. So that content cannot be easily Google. You cannot find the answer to that in a Google search, and you cannot find another episode that has been done before on someone else's show, basically asking the same types of questions or having the same type of vibe or same type of camaraderie, the thing that makes your show special, basically.
That is such a great call out, providing content that you can't Google. I think that's a really great filter to sort of put your content through, put those conversations through before you go down the road of starting your own podcast. Now, not everybody has a podcast in them for whatever reason, right? And so the next best thing is being a guest on someone else's podcast, right? And so do you have advice for people seeking out or appearing on other people's podcasts as a way to create content for themselves the same way they might if they started their own?
Totally. And this can be a really great place to start, to be honest, because especially if you've never done anything in podcasting, it is easier to get a feel for if you like the channel in terms of it's something that you feel like you're a natural at, or it's not something that drains you to the point where you don't look forward to doing it. And so you can test out being a guest on maybe 5 or 10 different shows by reaching out to them with your expertise about what you can teach and provide value to the listeners. It's not about selling your product. And it's not about all about you. It's about the listeners being able to walk away with something, guidance, playbooks, information that they can implement in their lives or careers, and it will help them today. That is the entire lens with which you can bring. But it's easier to do that than create and launch a podcast from scratch. So it's faster to do a podcast tour. That's kind of what we call it, as a podcast tour. And so, but the beautiful thing is these strategies play hand in hand. So one of the best ways to actually grow your podcast is by being a guest on other similar podcasts and then mentioning yours if it comes up, naturally, and getting some conversion from listeners who listen to a marketing podcast, let's say, to your marketing podcast. We already know they listen to marketing podcasts. They've just listened to you talk for 30 minutes. And so presumably the conversion rate from their listener, and they listen to podcasts, which is obvious. And so the conversion rate of that listener to your show is going to be higher than any other form of marketing. Like getting someone from Twitter to your podcast is more challenging and will be at a lower rate than getting someone from a marketing podcast to your marketing podcast. So all things else being equal, it's ideal to have a podcast, if you're going to create one, already created when you go and do your podcast tour, so that you can drive people to your show that's already created and build up your audience and listenership. Because building a listenership is difficult, and doing a podcast tour is, on shows that have already got some audience built, and you can get that awareness there. But the trade-off is it's not an owned channel. So when you're doing a podcast tour, it's more ephemeral. You're going to, do an interview, it will get published, but that audience and that feed is not something that you own. And so the sort of gold standard is to get awareness in all of the places that your audience is paying attention to, and drive them back to channels that you own. And so that's why these strategies play very well hand in hand. You can apply that to all sorts of different marketing strategies, but if we're just talking podcast to podcast marketing, that's a really, really nice way to think about it.
And that circles it back to the good old PR strategy of being properly prepped when you do any kind of an interview, to be able to drop not only your subject matter expertise, but the reference links and the places, the landing places that you do own, to send people back to find more information or to connect with you on your platforms. I couldn't agree more. I'm a big fan of podcasts. Like I said, I'm an old radio guy, so talking comes naturally to me. But doing this podcast every week it has been wonderful, because I'm able to shine a light on other people who have interesting stories, and then I encourage them to point back to their stuff at the end of the show as well. And I've also been a guest on other PR podcasts, PR style podcasts. So that's a lot of fun too. And I agree that, I've got wonderful reactions from those appearances as much as I have from my own show. So that's really great to hear you echo there. I guess maybe as a final conversation point here is, what is the best strategy, or what lens should you look through to devise a podcast strategy? If you're trying to figure out, do I start my own? Do I be a guest on someone else's? What do I want to do? What do I want to accomplish? Can we bring it full circle?
Yeah. So my recommendation, if you're getting started from scratch, you haven't done either of the strategies, or really any podcast strategy, would be to first try and get some interviews on shows that already exist, ideally about 5 to 10, and get a feel for the channel. Get a feel for how you articulate your message, the topics you can teach, things like that. And in the back of your mind, think about devising your own podcast strategy at the same time. And then creating your own show, I think, is very important. And there's really two things to think about. One is competitive research, and the other is audience research. So most people, when they create their own podcast, is they come up with a good idea, but they don't talk to anybody else about it. They don't validate it. and they don't research it, whether it is a good idea or not. Usually people who are creating podcasts have a good feel for their audience. So their ideas oftentimes are not too far off of what is the best strategy. But what we have found is by doing two simple things, competitive research and audience research, you will put yourself in a position to pretty much not fail. And so audience research is getting on calls or sending survey questions to the people you would want to be listeners of the podcast, asking them what content they consume, what podcasts they listen to. If they could learn from anybody, who would it be? What would it be about? And what you're trying to learn is, what are the topics that they most care about that there's still a need for in the market. And then at the same time, you're cross-referencing what shows with competitive research, what shows already exist that cover this topic, and how many of them are there, and are they covering it the exact way we're trying to? And what this is going to tell you is, how much do you need to differentiate? If there are 30 shows that already have the same concept that you want to run with, you're going to have to find an angle that is slightly different, or else otherwise, again, you're kind of going to be more of like seen as like a commodity option. Like, you can win on personality, but if the topics and the format is pretty much the same, it's really difficult to stand out. So that's how I would think about really like spending the majority of your time, not on the equipment you're going to buy or the platform you're going to record on and things like that, but the strategy. What is the promise we are going to make to the listener that they are going to receive when they hit play? And how are we going to ensure that when they hit play, we deliver on that promise such that they want to make it to the end of every episode and never miss another episode? So that is the goal. And I think doing that, plus going and making a list of the 100 or 200 podcasts that exist in your space that you can try and collaborate with and be a guest on, or offer for them to be a guest on your show, or promote each other. You will have a winning strategy with both of those.
That sounds like a fantastic blueprint. Thank you so much, Erik, for sharing that knowledge. You taught me a few new things as well. So this is great. We are going to segue now into the rapid fire question portion of our podcast. This is where we have a little fun. Steal a page from inside the actor's studio. I still feel like I'm dating myself with that. Now that I wrote it like 2 years ago, and I'm like, oh man, dude, does everybody know what I'm talking about? Anyway. But
I know
we're just we'll have a little, right? You know it. All right, fine. Yeah. So we're going to have a little fun here. Let's hit these rapid fire questions. Rapid fire question number 1, Erik, here you go. What's your favorite news source?
I would say Twitter. Twitter is my favorite news source.
All right. Yeah. Now we're going to give you an opportunity to change that answer when we ask you rapid fire question number 2, which is, what is your favorite social media platform?
If I'm allowed, I'm going to say the same thing. Twitter. Twitter is my favorite. I like them all, but I like Twitter because it is just based on information and text. It's not based on how cool you look or how funny or good you can make like videos. Yeah, I just like the written text.
Twitter is the most popular answer for questions 1 and 2, in fact.
Okay,
and
cool.
All our guests. It reminds me of the old AP Wire news feed, like sitting in the corner of the newsroom, just banging out copy. And so that's how I use Twitter. Other people use Twitter for other things. We're not going to talk about that. Rapid fire question number 3, though, coffee or alcohol?
For me, so I would say coffee. I like cappuccinos, and I actually like an energy drink from Jocko Willink, who's a famous podcaster. He's got an energy drink called Jocko Go. So I will kind of add a little like caveat in there too for that, but that one's good.
All right. Shout out to Jocko for sure. Rapid fire question number 4. What's your favorite on the run food?
Chipotle.
Oh,
for sure.
All right.
I could eat. I don't know if that's technically on the run, but I could eat Chipotle for lunch and dinner every day.
Well, if you make it on the run, it's on the run. And rapid fire question number 5. Here's where we get a little philosophical. What do you want to be after you finish this career?
I don't really ever plan to retire and sit on a beach in the traditional sense. So I always think I will be building things, but my number one motivation in life is to be the best dad I can be. And so I hope that just as time goes on, like I'm able to continue to level up and focus on that, in the best way possible. But I don't ever see, selling a company and just not ever building or, continuing to tinker, create products, create services. Like it's just fun. Business is fun to me. So yeah.
I agree. I'm in the same boat. Absolutely. Well, Erik, this has been a great conversation. Please let people know how they can find you and your companies online.
Thank you, Jody. I appreciate it. This was a lot of fun. So Lemonpie is at lemonpie.fm if you are interested in being a guest on your customer's favorite podcasts, or if you are interested in creating your audience's favorite podcast, you could check us out at hatch.fm. And I'm always available. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Twitter. And I have been talking about podcasting for like 10 years straight, and I'm not tired of it yet. So I'm always down to jam with anybody on the topic.
Sounds good. We'll find you there. Thanks again, Erik. And thank you, everyone, for listening. Please remember to subscribe to the show, connect with us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok at The PR Podcast, and send us a question or a comment. Our intro is by Christopher Apple. You can find him and his fantastic photography on Instagram at Christopher_APPOLDT. Check him out there and hire him for all of your photography needs. You can find me online at Jody Fisher on all the socials and on the web at jodyfisherpr.com. We'll see you next time on the PR Podcast.